Hey there, and welcome to day 19 of 31 Days of Horror. If you haven't checked out, there are 18 more videos starting at the beginning of the month of different horror movies that I have watched and little reviews of each. So if you feel like catching up, there's plenty more on my channel. We are on day 19. Um, Once again, sorry for the late uploads. I watch movies, but I don't usually record on the weekends because I'm busy spending time with my family, and that will always be a bit more important than recording. So we're playing catch up today, and we're on day 19. And today I watched Resident Evil Death Island. This is an animated movie, so not to be confused with the Mila Jovovich series that is, pretty prominent. It's the most recognizable Resident Evil movie series. This movie is actually the same animation style as the video games. So if the video games are really what you're familiar with, if you've played the uh, any of the games in recent history, even some of the reboots that have come out or the remasters that have come out of Resident Evil 4 and 2, I believe. Um, I It's interesting here. I love the video games. I really do. One of a core memory of mine is way back when the first Resident Evil was released on the original PlayStation. That was actually the first game console that I owned that I had actually really wanted and had kind of researched and was like, oh, and it's got this game, this game, this game. Begged for my parents for it, got it for Christmas. It was really that first experience for me. It was the very first PlayStation, and I had a demo disc because my parents wouldn't get me for mature rated games because at the time I was very young. Um, but I had demo discs of all of the games that were kind of available at the time. So, Gex, Enter the Gecko, Spyro, Crash Bandicoot, a little Rascal in there, just the old ones, Cool Borders, stuff like that. And I loved them. And so I would play the demos, and then from playing the demos, I could be like, "Mom, I've played this game. I'm good at it. Can I get this one for Christmas? Whatever." And one of the demos that was available was the beginning of Resident Evil, and you would go through the mansion that we see at the beginning of the first movie and the mansion that we see in the first game. And I remember I vividly remember the very first scene of seeing a zombie for the first time. You around that kind of, there's that little room off the dining room. I very clearly, I remember that, and I remember it being scary. And looking back on it now, I mean, it was all pixels. You could barely see anything. It was more that psychological, from the age that I was. But I will never forget the feeling of that first scare in Resident Evil. And that's kind of always stuck with me. So then when they started making the Resident Evil movies, and they did the first one with Mila Jovovich, I was so excited for it. Because up to that point, so many of the Resident Evil games had come out, but I had never played them myself because I wasn't allowed to. I wasn't allowed to play horror games. I wasn't allowed to play for mature rated games. So I'd only ever experienced them watching other people play or seeing those little demos. Or as I got older and more into watching YouTube videos myself, I would watch other people play Resident Evil games. And that's actually how I interact with a lot of different video games. Because I'm not very good at them. I wasn't allowed to play, shooters and things when I was growing up, so I don't have a lot of the hand-eye coordination for any of the games that require, shooting an enemy or something. But I still really love the stories, and I love the scares, and I think, I mean, and we're seeing from the adaptations now, there is so much storytelling going on in video games that has gone unnoticed for so long. And I think it's easy, because the regular Resident Evil movies that we're used to, the live action ones, are very much action movies with some horror elements. I think it's kind of easy to sort of dismiss video game movies like they're all going to be that sort of actiony, not always cohesive story, things like that. that you find in kind of campy or maybe not traditionally good horror movie adaptations. I think a really good example of this is the Doom franchise, um, which is iconic in any way, shape, or form that you look at it, but has been turned into some very, very poor movies, even though they starred some pretty good people. And I think the same can be said for Resident Evil, but I have to say personally, I really do enjoy the Mila Jovovich series. Um, but there is so much storytelling just to be had within the games when you consider, the first few games, you have 1, 2, and 3, and then you have 4 where it's village, and there was that village, and you weren't fighting, people in Raccoon City anymore. You weren't fighting zombies in Raccoon City. You were fighting like infected villagers, and so that was different. So this movie, Resident Evil Death Island, follows the games and the characters from the games, and they use the animation style from the games. Now, I watched this on Netflix. Netflix seems to have a vested interest in the Resident Evil franchise. They did make a very short-lived 1 season of a live-action show. It wasn't the worst, but it wasn't the best. Kind of what they decided to do with Wesker was a little odd. But anyway, getting back to this particular film, they have it listed under anime, which I think is a bit interesting. It makes sense because of the origins of the film and all, but it doesn't necessarily have that animation style that people are quick to recognize. It very much is animated in the style of the video games themselves, so the character designs you will recognize. The movie itself follows 4 characters that we're very familiar with from the Resident Evil franchise, whether you're familiar with the games or the live action films. This particular movie follows Chris and Claire Redfield, Leon Kennedy, and Jill Valentine, and it incorporates the other characters here and there that you may recognize from uh, the other games, but you probably wouldn't recognize necessarily from the movies, because the movies kind of cherry picked which characters they were interested in using and how they wanted to kind of apply them to the story. And that's totally fine. But this, like I said, sticks closer to the games. So if you're familiar with the games, then this movie would probably make a lot more sense to you than if you didn't if you weren't familiar with the games, or if your only real reference was the live action movies. That being said, I think some of the scares are very good. The premise is that there is a breakout of the T virus in San Francisco, and the 4 of them end up traveling with a kind of tourist group to Alcatraz, and they find that the infection epicenter, it's coming from Alcatraz. There's a guy who has some big evil scientific plot to release the T virus all over the world because of he's experienced something negative as somebody who worked for Umbrella. There's always some sort of revenge plot. There's always some sort of kind of, I don't want to say convoluted, but there's always some sort of misguided reason why the villains in Resident Evil are doing whatever it is they're doing. And I think it's cool because it's a game. Because the Resident Evil is a game at its heart, and we're not necessarily always concerned with the motive when we're playing a video game. We're concerned with how we can interact with the environment, how we interact with the story, how our choices change or affect the story that's unfolding. And so it's kind of hard sometimes, I think, for film companies to do adaptations of video game stories, because so much of video games requires our participation. And I find that one of the things that's really neat about the Resident Evil animated movies, and there are a few of them, this is not the only one. I've seen a couple of them. I believe they're on Netflix. Off the top of my head, I can't name them because it's been years. But they kind of fill in little gaps of what are these characters doing when they're not in the games. Um, and I think it's interesting because you have Resident Evil 5, I believe, is one of the last times that we see Chris Redfield before we see him in Resident Evil Village. Um, and so then we have Resident Evil 6 in there that I don't believe that one's subtitled. And then we have Resident Evil 7 that's Biohazard, and then we had Village. There was 8 that just came out a few years ago. Everybody was a big fan of the big woman, Lady D. And the reason that I bring those up is because it's also kind of cool because they do use the same voice actors as a lot of the games, which is neat. Because most prominently, Leon Kennedy has been voiced by Matt Mercer, who, if you're nerdy like me, he is a very prominent dungeon master for an online D&D game that has gained a lot of notoriety, and it has now spawned some Amazon TV shows called Critical Role. But also you might recognize Matt Mercer from a few other, he does a lot of video game voices. He also does a lot of anime dub voices, and he's been doing that for a very, very long time, to the point where when I was actually researching just some basic things for this video, I was going through his filmography trying to figure out when he started voicing Leon, and it was in Resident Evil 6. That was his the first time voicing Leon. And then since then, when Leon has come up, with the exception of the rebooted games, he has voiced the character of Leon. And he voices him again in this movie. And the reason that I brought that up is because he's done so many voices. I was just kind of looking up, like, oh, I'll just add a couple of things. Oh, he's the voice of this, he's the voice of that. And as I was going through the list, it's so long and so packed with different things that he's done, that he's lent his voice to, that he's acted in. I forgot what I was looking for. And I had gone down many pages before I even found Resident Evil 6 to find that was the first he was in. So just if you're curious, if you're ever looking through like his IMDb page, he's done an awful lot. So you'd be familiar with his voice. I mean, he's done background characters and things. He's done the voice of every villager in things. He's done like Overwatch 2. He's done voices in The Last of Us. There's plenty of things that you would definitely recognize his voice from. And so it's nice that there's this kind of familiarity when you're getting into this story, because you already know the characters. They don't have to do any introductions. They don't have to tell you that Chris and Claire are brother and sister. They don't have to tell you that Jill Valentine's a badass. They don't have to tell you that like Leon knows what's up. You're just sort of familiar with that at this point going into the movie. That being said, I don't necessarily think that this is a movie that, if you didn't already have an interest in Resident Evil, I don't think it's necessarily a movie that somebody just scrolling through looking for something spooky to watch. I don't necessarily know that they would choose this. Because it's a specific interest. That being said, like I said, it does have the scares. We have scary monsters. We have a scary concept. We have, a countdown clock, of timing. And essentially, it kind of functions as like an hour and a half long cutscene of a video game. And really all you lose is kind of the interactions and the physically, controlling the characters. But I think the story flows very similarly to a video game, and I think they did a great job of kind of keeping the motives and the dialogue and everything in the same vein as a video game. It's not overly complicated, it's not overly, produced, it's not trying to be anything more than it is. It's just kind of a little side story within the Resident Evil lexicon of, so why would these characters even know each other? I mean, because we've seen them show up in games and they interact with each other, like, oh yeah, that's Chris, or oh yeah, that's Leon. And you sort of wonder, like, oh, when would they have encountered each other? And we've seen them cross paths, we've seen them interact with the same things. And so it's just kind of a nice little story that kind of pulls them all together, and it was definitely an enjoyable watch. If you're not particularly interested in the Resident Evil franchise in itself, then I don't really think it's the movie for you. if you do have an interest in the Resident Evil franchise and you wished that the live action movies maybe leaned a little bit more on the horror side than they did on the action side, then I do think that the animated Resident Evil movies would be way more up your alley, because they focus like it's stories that could be in the games. And I'm guessing that they're just stories that have been, kind of come up with. There's stories that have been developed that maybe they couldn't find a way to make them game material, but they're still stories that are entertaining. And I like the fact that they've found a medium to tell them. It's a short, Netflix movie or whatnot. I think it's just a great idea. It's enjoyable. And it's a little bit something different, because the thing is, horror is great. But one of the things that's great about horror is that there are so many different things that scare people. There are people who are afraid of balloons. There are people who are afraid of cats. There are people who are afraid of bunnies. There's people who are afraid of clouds. And horror is a genre where you name it and someone has tried to figure out a way to make it into a movie, into a way that you can kind of experience those scares in a safe environment from your own home. You can kind of pick it apart. You can feel things out. And video games are a part of that. And the fact that we have such a huge horror video game genre, that's a huge, huge part of video games now, because people love that scare. And when you're interacting with it, it's even better. I mean, playing a video game can almost be like combining a haunted house with being able to stay home. You don't have to get up, get dressed. You don't have to worry about somebody accidentally touching you. But there's a good chance you're going to sit in a dark room. You're going to be, all tense. You're going to be doing this. You're going to be staring at the screen, and then, oh God, jump scare, and you're in your own home, and that's something that you've interacted with. You had to do something in order to have that scare, as opposed to just kind of sitting on the couch and observing. And so if that's something that you really enjoy, if that's something that you embrace, if you love horror games, check out these kinds of movies. So there's Resident Evil, Death Island. Every once in a while, you can find video game kind of derived animated movies. And it's something that anime seems to really kind of gravitate to. Kind of making adaptations of stories in a way where you can watch them maybe more condensed. You can watch them, where they're just telling the story instead of having to play through it, because a lot of people are like me. They love video games, but they're not very good at them. So even when I do try to play things myself, sometimes the story gets confused, I lose my place, or I stop playing because it's too hard, and then I don't get to experience that. These are an excellent way to get those vibes, to get those scares, to get the scenery, to learn the characters, without actually playing the games yourselves. And without spoiling the games for yourself, too. So, that being said, it was an enjoyable movie. I enjoyed the afternoon. I think it was a really cool aspect of the genre to explore, because you don't always see a ton of that. And overall, I think I'd probably give it between 3 and 4 stars. It was very good. It's rather, niche. So it's a little hard to, give it a higher rating, only because if you're not into those kinds of things, it wouldn't necessarily be enjoyable. But that being said, hey, give it a watch, see if you enjoy it, and then let me know in the comments what you think. And I will talk to you later. Tomorrow's day 20. Catch you later. Bye.